The Godswood was silent that morning, but not in peace. Ned Stark stood beneath the ancient weirwood tree, its red leaves whispering faintly in the still air. The carved face bled softly, crimson tears trickling down the pale bark like the sorrow of old gods long forgotten. It was here, in this sacred place of prayer and silence, that Ned Stark had come seeking guidance. But the vision that came had not brought him peace. It brought warning. He had seen the Iron Throne wreathed in fire. He had seen his own head severed from his body, eyes staring upward while the crowd screamed. He had seen his daughters, cloaked in blood and fear, and a boy with a lion's grin standing over Robb's body with a crown. The old gods had spoken, clearer than ever before. They had offered him a glimpse of what would come should he choose the path of honor over truth, silence over sacrifice. And Ned Stark had done something no Stark should ever do. He turned his back on the vision. That morning, as he rose from the cold earth, he didn't speak of it. Not to Catelyn, not to Maester Luwin, not even to Benjen. He held it close, locking it deep within the vault of his heart. The gods were testing him, he told himself. Dreams were only dreams. His honor, his name, mattered more than shadows and whispers. The raven from King's Landing arrived just 2 days later. Jon Arryn was dead, and like that, the vision began to unfold. King Robert rode into Winterfell with the weight of old friendship and new expectation. He looked older, thicker, slower, but still dangerous. Like a bear too tired to hunt, but not too tired to maul. Robert asked Ned to be his hand, and with a sigh carved from years of duty, Ned agreed. Catelyn protested, Bran fell, and the wheel of fate creaked into motion once more. But this time, Ned carried the weight of knowing. He'd seen it all. What would happen if he left Winterfell? What would befall his family? What Cersei would do, what Littlefinger would spin, and yet he went anyway, not because he was blind, but because he believed the future could be shaped by will alone. He believed he could change it, but the capital was a spider's nest of liars, and Ned Stark, for all his strength, had no fangs. In the Red Keep, shadows move faster than light, Varys whispered. Littlefinger smirked. The Queen watched him with eyes like daggers dipped in poison. Ned felt the weight of every step in that place, but still he moved with the calm of a man who thought himself right. He investigated Jon Arryn's death. He discovered the truth about Cersei's children. He wrote letters. He planned quietly. He did not act. And that's where it began to unravel. One evening, as he knelt alone in the Godswood of the Red Keep, he felt the air shift. The whisper of leaves that didn't belong to that southern tree echoed in his ear like ghosts. You saw, and still you did nothing. He froze. It wasn't guilt. It was something colder. Regret hadn't reached him yet. It was still too early for that. But it would come. A few weeks later, Robert lay, dying, gored by a boar. Ned moved to protect his friend's son, only to hesitate. He gave Cersei a chance to flee. He warned her. The vision had shown him this moment, had screamed at him to strike fast, strike first. But Ned Stark was not a man to kill children or threaten women. He was a man of honor, and honor had teeth. The city turned against him. His men were slaughtered. He was dragged to the dungeons. And as he sat in the black cell, surrounded by rats and mold and silence, Ned Stark finally began to understand. The vision hadn't been a warning. It had been a test, and he had failed. The black cells beneath the Red Keep were colder than the north. Ned Stark sat in the darkness, back against the wet stone wall, wrists raw from the iron shackles. The stale air reeked of rot and piss. The scurrying of rats in the corners became his only company. In those endless hours, stripped of name and honor, he didn't think of kings or betrayals. He thought of his daughters, of Robb, of the Godswood back home, of what he'd seen beneath that red-leafed weirwood. He'd seen war, fire, his son pierced by arrows, Sansa screaming, Arya with blood on her hands. He had seen what would happen if he left Winterfell, and he had done it anyway. Now, the world, above, spun in chaos. The silence of his cell couldn't drown out the echoes of betrayal that clawed at his mind. He had believed in mercy, in giving Cersei a chance to run, to spare her children from shame. But she hadn't run. She had smiled. She had used his mercy to tighten the noose. Varys came, cloaked in shadows and soft words. His voice was like silk stretched over a dagger. "You should have taken the throne, Lord Stark," he said one night, eyes glinting like a spider's. "You knew the truth. You held the proof. You had the power, and you gave it away." Ned didn't answer. He no longer wasted words on those who wore masks, but the eunuch wasn't finished. "You were warned by your dreams, by your gods, and still you chose honor." Ned clenched his fists, jaw tight. Varys crouched beside him, voice low. "This city devours honorable men. They are too easy to swallow." And with that he left, cloak swishing like a snake slithering into the dark. Above, the wolves were stirring. Robb Stark had received the raven. The north was on fire. Catelyn's grief had turned to rage. She rallied the bannermen, called the Tullys, and sent scouts riding hard. Robb, barely a man, held court in Winterfell with the look of a boy, wearing a sword too big for his soul. But he had his father's eyes. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice shook the hall. "They took my father. They will not take the north." He hadn't known of the vision. Ned had never told them. So now Robb marched south, into the exact storm his father had once glimpsed and dismissed. The trap had already been sprung before the boy had taken his first step. Sansa stood in the lion's den. At the mercy of Cersei's fake smiles and cold commands, she wept more than she slept. Her dreams were filled with blood and screaming. Arya, vanished from the castle, had slipped into the shadows like a ghost. Somewhere out there she survived on rats and rage. Joffrey, drunk on power, paraded around the court like a boy king in a cruel play, his every decision darker than the last. He mocked Sansa, beat her with words, and laughed when she cried. But one evening, she stood at her window and whispered, "I wish I'd never come here." And in that moment, she understood her father, how it felt to live with choices made for honor, only to be betrayed by those without any. In the black cell, Ned dreamed again. This time, he wasn't under the Godswood. He was standing before it. Winterfell was burning. The tree screamed, the red leaves on fire. He saw Robb on the battlefield, surrounded. Arrows rained from above. He saw Arya in a cloak stabbing a man in the dark. He saw Sansa sitting beside a monster on a throne of swords, her eyes empty. He saw a sword, ice, raised high, then brought down. And then he woke, sweat pouring, heart pounding. It was no longer a vision, it was memory, a future so close it had begun to rot the present. Ned Stark was no fool. He understood then, in the deepest part of himself, that by ignoring the Godswood's vision, he had not changed fate. He had guaranteed it. And now, the only thing left to do was break. Not for himself, but for the last chance his daughters had. When the guards came for him, he did not resist. He stood tall, though every part of him trembled. He walked through the Red Keep like a dead man walking, not toward justice, but toward a sacrifice of silence, because the only thing more dangerous than knowing the future was trying to change it and failing. The sun was blinding that morning. Dragged from the dungeons, bathed and dressed in fine clothes, Ned Stark stood beneath the sky of King's Landing for the first time in weeks. But the air smelled no sweeter. The robes felt no warmer. Everything around him reeked of death and deceit. He knew what day it was. The crowd had gathered restless and hungry. Lords and commoners alike pressed against the square, whispering, laughing, waiting. The stage was set. The boy king sat on the iron throne, legs too short to reach the floor, smirking like he had won a war. And beside him, Cersei Lannister stood. In cold silence, her eyes fixed not on her son, but on the man they had broken. Eddard Stark, the man who had once stood tall as Warden of the North, now stepped into the sun as a traitor, at least in the eyes of the mob. He looked thinner, older. His beard was unkempt, his gaze hollow. But he walked on, every step echoing a silent admission. He had lost. The Godswood vision had shown him a choice: save his pride and let the world burn, or bleed for his family, and live in disgrace. He had chosen wrong, and now he would pay the price. He had begged Varys for his daughters, pleaded that Sansa be spared, that Arya, wherever she was, not be hunted. He had agreed to confess treason, to bend the knee, to abandon truth, all for the promise that his blood would end with him. It was the only trade left to make. Sansa stood near the front of the crowd, pale as ash. Her lips trembled as she looked at her father, so far away yet so familiar. She didn't understand. He wasn't a traitor, he was her father. He was the most honest man in all of Westeros. But he had written the letters, he had signed the confession, he had bent the knee. And now he was going to lie before all of them. The words burned as they came from his lips. I, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King, confessed to plotting treason against the rightful king, Joffrey Baratheon. He heard the gasps, the jeers, the cheers. He didn't flinch. I conspired with Robert's brothers to deny the crown. To his true-born son, I sought to usurp the throne, to destroy the realm, to cast us into war. Each sentence was a dagger, not into his body, but into everything he had lived for. He saw Arya then, just a flash of her face. In the crowd, hidden in plain sight, eyes wide, hands clenched, a child of wolves in a city of lions. He wanted to cry out, to warn her, but he couldn't. She was free. That was enough. He looked at Sansa, his sweet summer child, who didn't understand this kind of cold. She still believed in songs, in honor, in mercy. He had lied to protect her, and now she would grow up in a world built on that lie. Cersei stepped forward, lips tight. "Let him take the black," she whispered to Joffrey, her voice like stone wrapped in silk. "Send him to the wall. The North will calm. The war might end." But the boy had other ideas. He stood. "My mother wishes mercy. My council begs for honor. But I am the king, and the king does as he likes." He turned to Sir Eiland Payne and said the words that would burn into history, "Bring me his head." There was a silence then, not shock, not disbelief, but the cold, heavy stillness of fate sealing its mouth shut. Cersei lunged forward, hissing his name. Sansa screamed. Varys stepped forward, but too late. Arya tried to fight her way through the crowd. Too small, too late. And Ned Stark closed his eyes. He saw Winterfell. He saw his children. He saw the weirwood tree, and the blood that had warned him. He knelt. And when the sword fell, it was not just the end of a man. It was the end of the last chance. The realm had to stop what was coming, because now the War of the Five Kings would begin, and Ned Stark could no longer stop it. The raven reached Winterfell before the blood dried on the steps of the Great Sept. It arrived at dawn, black wings beating against pale skies, a scroll tied tightly to its leg. Maester Luwin's hands trembled as he opened it. Catelyn Stark was at Riverrun with her dying father, and Robb had been holding court in her absence, learning to wear his father's silence like a second skin. When Luwin read the message, he didn't speak. He simply handed it to Robb, his face pale and empty. Robb read it once, then again, and something inside him cracked. His hand crushed the parchment, and his voice, cold as steel, echoed through the hall. "Call the banners." By midday, the drums of war thundered through the north. From White Harbour to Carhold, from Bear Island to Deepwood Motte, the wolves answered their prince. The Stark sigil flew high again, not as a warning, but a promise. Justice would come, not from a court, but from fire and blood. Catelyn returned 3 days later, her eyes swollen with tears before anyone spoke a word. She had seen the look in Robb's eyes once before, in Ned's, the day he executed a deserter in the snow. That calm rage, that quiet grief, that unmovable sense of duty. Her son was no longer a boy. He had become something else. She pulled him into her arms. He did not cry. Neither did she. The lords gathered at Moat Cailin. Robb sat at the centre. Grey wind at his feet, his bannermen watching him not as a boy, but as the Stark they would follow into hell. Great John Umber, roaring and half-drunk, slammed his fist against the table. "The Lannisters think they can kill a wolf and not be bitten back," he growled. "I say we cut off Jaime Lannister's balls and feed them to the crows." Cheers echoed across the tent, but Robb raised his hand. His voice was calm. "This isn't for glory," he said. "This isn't for vengeance." Silence fell. "This is for my father, for justice, for the North." They looked at him, a boy barely 16, but already more a man than most, twice his age. "We ride south. We take River Run. We free my uncle. We bring our armies to the Twins. And we cross. We strike hard. We strike fast. And when we find Tywin Lannister," his eyes narrowed, "we bring him the head of every man who called my father a traitor." Far to the west, at Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister sharpened swords and strategies. The death of Ned Stark had been more than a political move. It had been bait. He knew the North would rise. He had counted on it. "Boys with swords," he said to Kevan. "Wolves with honor. They're predictable, and predictable men are dead men." But even Tywin underestimated what was coming. He thought Robb Stark would fight like his father, with rules, with caution. But grief changes things. Grief makes wolves savage. In a forgotten part of King's Landing, Arya Stark was surviving. She had watched her father die. She had heard the sword sing. She had felt the world shatter, but she hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She had vanished into the alleyways, her face covered in soot and blood. Now she moved like a shadow. She stole bread. She listened. She remembered names. And every night she whispered her list: Joffrey, Cersei, Eileen Payne, Meryn Trant, the Hound. She was learning to forget who she was, to forget warmth and laughter and Winterfell, because that Arya was dead. The girl who remained was something colder, sharper, and she would not wait for war. She was the war. Back in the north, the old gods whispered again, but this time to Bran. The boy lay in his bed, half broken, half dreaming. The ravens came in the night. The tree in the Godswood bled again. And this time Bran didn't look away. He saw his father's final moment. The sword falling, but then he saw more. He saw wolves howling beneath red skies. He saw rivers running with blood. He saw Robb on a throne of bones. He saw the north burned. And then he woke up, screaming. Maester Luwin rushed to his side, but Bran said nothing, because in that moment he understood. The gods had warned Ned. Ned had not listened, and now they were warning Bran. But the war had already begun. The south was warmer, but Robb Stark felt nothing. His army thundered across the neck of Westeros like a storm wrapped in steel and fur. 20,000 men rode behind him, archers, spearmen, bannermen, sworn by blood and vengeance. Each night they camped under the stars, fires flickering like angry ghosts. Songs were forbidden. Joy had no place in war. They had crossed the Green Fork with no resistance. Robb moved with a fury that shocked even the seasoned lords. He wasted no time on feasts, no breath on speeches. His orders were sharp and quiet. He rode at the front, always at the front. There was no honor left to defend, only memory, only justice. At the Twins, the army halted. The ancient towers loomed like crooked teeth above the crossing. Walder Frey's keep was as cold and grey as the man himself, old, spiteful and sly. Catelyn Stark rode ahead to speak with him, her cloak flapping behind her like a banner of mourning. Inside, Lord Frey sat surrounded by squabbling sons and barely wed daughters. He sneered at Catelyn like a man who'd waited too long for the day the world needed him. "You want my bridge," he said, tapping his withered fingers. "On the table. I want a queen." Catelyn kept her voice steady. "My son needs to cross. We'll remember your loyalty." Walder licked his lips. "I want him to marry one of my girls." Catelyn froze. "A promise," Frey added, smiling like a corpse. "Or no crossing. And your war ends before it begins." Catelyn returned. To Robb that evening, her face ashen. "You won't like what he asks." Robb read her eyes, not her words. "I'll do what I must." And so he swore an oath. He promised to marry a Frey girl. And in that moment, the whisper of the old gods stirred in the trees again, unheard. Robb's next move was swift and brutal. With Frey's bridge behind him, he split his forces and sent a decoy army west, led by Rose Bolton, who fought like a butcher, not a knight. Meanwhile, Robb struck south with his best riders and descended on Jaime Lannister's camp near River Run, like a wolf tearing through sheep. It wasn't a battle. It was a message. The Kingslayer, arrogant and outnumbered, never saw it coming. He was dragged from the mud, bloodied and beaten, tossed at Robb's feet like prey. Jaime looked up at the young Stark and laughed through bloodied teeth. "So, the cub has claws." Robb didn't smile. "You killed my father." Jaime tilted his head. "No, that was your king." But Robb already knew what the truth was. Worth. At River Run, the banners of House Tully flapped again. Edmure had returned, wounded and proud, while Hoster Tully lay dying in bed. Catelyn was greeted by her brother's stubborn grin and her father's withering silence. Robb was hailed as king in the north. Lords knelt, men cried. Robb stood stiffly as the crown, roughly forged, cold and heavy, was placed on his head. The words echoed through the great hall. "The king in the north." But inside, Robb felt nothing. It wasn't a crown he wanted. It was his father's voice, his mother's smile, his sister's home, and he knew none of it would return until the Lannisters were ashes. Back in King's Landing, Cersei drank, her son ruled, but the crown was cracking already. Whispers filled the halls. The north was burning, and the south was bleeding. River Run had fallen. Jaime was captured, and worst of all, Sansa Stark now looked at her with quiet hatred. Not fear. Sansa no longer cried. She wrote letters she never sent. She whispered to shadows. She stared at Joffrey with eyes like ice. Cersei could feel the ghost of Eddard Stark in every silence. She hated it. She hated him. Even dead he was, breaking her house. Far away, Arya Stark was heading north in chains. Disguised as a boy, traveling with a group of black-cloaked criminals bound for the wall, she kept her blade close and her eyes sharper. She had stopped praying. The gods had watched her father die. Now she trusted no one. Every day she repeated her names like armor. Joffrey, Cersei, Eileen Payne, Meryn Trant, the Hound. Gendry rode beside her, unaware of who she was. "Hot," I complained. Lommy limped, and in the distance wolves howled through the woods. Something old was waking in her bones, something wild. In a dream, Bran saw a wolf at a feast. The guests laughed and drank. Music played, but the wolf sat in the corner, chained and bleeding. No one saw it. Then suddenly the music stopped. The feast turned red. The wolf's eyes met his own, and it whispered, "He swore an oath to the wrong man." Bran jolted awake, heart pounding. The ravens were back on the tower. This time they spoke no words. They just stared, and Bran knew. The war had only begun, but the real betrayal hadn't happened yet. The rains came to River Run like a curse, thick, heavy, relentless, the kind of rain that felt more like mourning than weather. Robb Stark stood at the balcony of the Tully Castle, watching the river swell. Behind him, lords squabbled over maps and messages. The war had turned brutal. Every mile south cost lives. The Lannisters retreated to Harrenhal and Casterly Rock, and whispers of Tywin's new alliances crept like mold into Robb's war table. He wasn't winning, he wasn't losing. He was bleeding. Each day news grew worse. The Greyjoys had risen in the west. Balon Greyjoy had declared himself king of the Iron Islands again. The North's coast was burning. Deepwood Motte was under siege. Theon Greyjoy, once raised as Robb's own brother, had turned traitor. "You should have drowned him when you had the chance," Gretchen muttered. Robb didn't answer, but that night, in private, he punched the stone wall of the castle until his knuckles bled. Meanwhile, letters arrived from the wall, grim, fragmented reports. The dead walking, rangers missing, ghost stories that made even the most hardened warriors pause. Catelyn read them in silence and burned them afterward. "We have no men to spare for ghosts," Robb said when she told him. But he said it with a shiver, because in his dreams he was starting to see the tree again, the Godswood, the vision his father once buried in silence. He dreamed of snow falling over battlefields, of crows circling a frozen north, of grey wind snarling at something that didn't bleed. Every time he woke, he felt like a child again, helpless, cold, and cursed. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell anyone, because to speak of omens in a war already lost by prophecy was madness. South, in Harrenhal, Tywin Lannister feasted with filth. His army sat in the ruin of a castle cursed by fire and death, plotting, scheming, waiting. Word had reached him that Robb was winning battles but losing allies. The North was strong, but it wasn't united. It was proud, and proud men were easy to break. That's when Peter Baelish arrived, with a smile and a poisoned tongue. He spoke of alliances, of deals, of marriages. "I hear young Robb has taken a Westerling girl into his bed," he said casually. Tywin's brow rose. So he broke his promise to Walder Frey. Littlefinger's smile widened. "Well then," he whispered, "we might not have to kill the wolf. He may slit his own throat for us." At the twins, Walder Frey received the news with narrowed eyes and a slow, raspy breath. He promised her. The room fell silent. He looked at his daughters, lined up like pigs at a market. "He promised her," he repeated, pointing to one of them, plain-faced, wide-eyed. And then his smile came. Not joy, not hurt. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for betrayal. "Send a raven to Lord Bolton," he said. "We'll give the wolf his feast." Back at River Run, Catelyn felt something shift. She noticed it in the halls, in the servants' eyes, in the silence of the lords. Whispers moved like wind through a graveyard. Robb was married now to Jane Westerling, sweet girl, soft-spoken, and already the realm called her his doom. Catelyn confronted him, face pale, voice low. "You broke your oath." "She saved my life, Mother," he said. "And I loved her." Catelyn closed her eyes. "So did your father. Once." He didn't answer, because love in this world was not a gift. It was a noose. Arya Stark, meanwhile, was closer to her brother than anyone knew, still disguised, still dirty, still alive. She had escaped Harrenhal with Gendry and Hot Pie, carrying only her list, her blade, and the weight of every lie she'd swallowed. When she heard whispers of Robb marching nearby, she smiled for the first time in months. She believed, truly, believed she would see her brother again. She believed the war would end. But as they crossed the river, they saw the banner of House Frey, and she felt a cold wind cut through her heart. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. Bran Stark dreamed of wolves. He dreamed of a feast where no one laughed, of music that played too long, of blood spilled into cups. The tree whispered to him again, "The lion does not fear the wolf at his own table." And Bran saw his brother Robb raising a cup, smiling, unaware. He screamed in his sleep. But there was no one left in Winterfell to hear him. The drums beat loud at the twins. Robb Stark rode through the gates with his head high, cloak soaked from days of travel, sword at his hip, and hope, for once, glimmering in his eyes. He had come for peace. A marriage between Edmure Tully and one of Walder Frey's daughters was to heal the wound his own broken oath had left behind. Robb thought it a fair trade, a sacrifice, a way to unite the North again, to move past the mistake he'd made when he followed his heart instead of his war. But Frey's hall was too warm, too quiet, too polite. Catelyn felt it first. The way Lord Walder watched with narrowed eyes, not cold, not kind, just waiting. The smiles were painted on every face like masks, stretched too tight. The food was fine, the wine was rich, the music flowed, and still her stomach twisted, because joy had no place in this war, and something about this celebration felt like walking into a tomb. Arya Stark stood just outside the twins. She could see the flickering lights through the windows, hear the music floating in the night air. She rode with the Hound now, though she hated him still. But Sandor had kept her alive. He knew danger, like dogs knew blood, and he had dragged her here, to the edge of what she'd been chasing for months. "My brother's inside," she whispered. "We're so close." The Hound looked up at the towers and said nothing. But his hand rested on his axe the whole time. He didn't trust feasts, he didn't trust fries, and neither did the gods. Inside the hall, the wedding proceeded. Edmure, to his shock, found his bride not ugly at all. Roslyn Frey was beautiful, demure and quiet, her face trembling more than his. They wed, they danced, they drank. Robb laughed for the first time in what felt like a year. Grey wind, his direwolf howled outside, locked in a pen. Walder Frey had insisted on it. "No beasts at the table," he said with a chuckle. Robb had agreed reluctantly. But Catelyn's eyes kept drifting to the musicians. They were playing the same song over and over. And then she heard it. "The Rains of Castamere." A Lannister song. A song of victory. A song of slaughter. She stood up, heart racing, scanning the room. Something was wrong. The doors closed. Walder Frey raised his cup. "Your Grace," he said, voice sharp, eyes gleaming. "I've given you bread and salt. I've hosted you under my roof. We're family now." He smiled. "But your father didn't honor his word, and I cannot allow that to go unpunished." Catelyn's breath caught. Her eyes fell to Rose Bolton, standing by the wall in silence, hand on his belt. She saw the glint of chainmail beneath his tunic. She screamed, "Robb!" But it was too late. The crossbows sang. The arrows pierced Robb's chest before he could draw his sword. 1, 2, 3. Catelyn lunged toward him, knocking over a table. Roslyn collapsed in terror. Edmure screamed as the Freys turned on the guests, knives in hands, smiles still fixed like death masks. Robb staggered back, blood pouring from his ribs. Catelyn crawled toward him, sobbing, hands trembling. The bannermen were falling all around. Men who had ridden with him for months, slaughtered like sheep. The great Jon, cut down trying to charge the door. Tallheart fell with a blade through his throat. Grey wind howled outside the walls, then went silent, and Catelyn lost herself. She grabbed Walder Frey's young wife, a trembling girl no older than Arya, and pressed a dagger to her throat. "Let him go," she shrieked. "You've killed them all. Let him go, and I swear." Walder Frey didn't blink. Rose Bolton stepped forward, bloody dagger in hand. His voice was calm. "The Lannisters send their regards." And he plunged. It into Robb's heart. Robb's eyes met his mother's one last time. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Then he fell. Catelyn Stark's scream was not of this world. She sliced the girl's throat with trembling hands, as if that could undo the moment, as if blood could balance blood. And then a fray blade slashed across her neck. Her body dropped beside her son's, and silence claimed the twins. Outside, Arya ran toward the gates. She had heard the screams. She had seen the Frey men drawing blades. She moved faster, heart pounding, but the hound grabbed her from behind, pulled her back, threw her onto his horse. "You want to die?" he barked. "Then keep running." But Arya didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at the castle as it burned behind her eyes. And in that moment she knew she would never be Arya Stark again. She would be vengeance. She would be death, because the Godswood had warned them all, and no one had listened. Snow fell softly in the north. Winter had come, not with banners or horns, but with silence, a quiet death that hung over every tree, every stone, every memory of what once was. At Winterfell, the halls were cold and empty. The ravens had stopped coming. The fires were few. Servants whispered of ghosts in the Godswood. Wolves howled at night and did not stop. Maester Luwin, old and weary, stood at the tower and looked out at the grey sky. He had received the raven, the one bearing the seal of House Frey, the one that spoke of the Red Wedding. He had read it once, then he had wept, then he had burned it. No words should ever carry such horror. Bran Stark dreamed again, but this time there was no Godswood. No tree, no red leaves, only snow, and a wolf, massive, broken, its fur matted with blood. It limped across the frozen ground, dragging something behind it. A crown. The voice came again, cold and cruel, not like the gods, like something older. He saw the future, and he left it to die. Bran woke in silence, heart hollow. He had known. The dream had always told him. His father had seen the path, had been shown the blood and the betrayal, but he had chosen honor, and now Robb was dead. Catelyn was dead. Arya was gone. Sansa was prisoner. And he, the broken boy, was the only Stark left who truly knew the cost. Not of war, but of ignoring fate. South, in the ruins of Riverrun's war camp, Rose Bolton stood tall, cloaked in silence, now Warden of the North by Lannister decree. Beside him his bastard son, Ramsay Snow, grinned like a dog off its leash. Winterfell would be theirs soon. The North would be ruled not by wolves, but by flayed men. Rose had served the vision better than Ned Stark ever did, not by following the gods, but by following power. He didn't care for omens. He didn't dream. He acted. And now he was winning. But somewhere, even Rose felt it, a chill in the wind that was not of weather. Something was watching. At the wall, Jon Snow received no raven, but he felt it. The day it happened, the exact hour, the wind shifted on the wall. Ghost lifted his head and growled into the white. Jon looked south, his breath fogging in the cold. Something terrible had happened, and he didn't know why. But he whispered, "Robb." Sam didn't ask. Dolorous Ed just muttered something about ghosts. But Jon couldn't sleep that night. He couldn't stop hearing Ned's voice in his head. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies. But the pack survives. But what if there was no pack left? What if Ned's choices hadn't saved them, but cursed them? In King's Landing, Sansa Stark wore grief like a mask. Her eyes had dried weeks ago. She no longer cried for her father, or her mother, or Robb. She walked the halls like a ghost, silent and sharp. Joffrey mocked her as always, but his jabs no longer reached her, because she had seen it. The moment the realm broke, the Lannisters celebrated the Red Wedding. Cersei called it justice. Tywin called it strategy. But Sansa called it the moment they declared war on fate itself. She prayed no longer to the Seven. only to the old gods, and not for peace, for vengeance. Far across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen stood in the firelight with her dragons sleeping at her feet. A rider from Westeros had arrived, an exiled knight who spoke of a northern king slain at a wedding, of a kingdom tearing itself apart, of wolves betrayed and burned. Daenerys looked at the fire. "What kind of men kill guests under their own roof?" she asked. "Men who fear prophecy," Sir Barristan said softly. "Men who try to cheat fate." She nodded once, then let fate burn them alive. And somewhere in the Riverlands, Arya Stark crossed a name off her list. She no longer remembered the sound of her father's voice, but she remembered the look in his eyes the last time she saw him. She remembered the way the sword fell. She remembered the silence. She rode, alone now, or with shadows. Faces changed, names changed, but the mission stayed the same. And when people asked her name, she gave none, because Arya Stark had died in King's Landing. Now she was only a knife looking for a heart. In the Godswood of Winterfell, the snow covered the red leaves. The old face on the weirwood wept frozen tears. No prayers were spoken there anymore. Only silence remained. But if one listened close, closer than breath, closer than bone, they'd hear it. A whisper, a curse. He could have stopped the War of 5 Kings, but he walked away. And now, all that was left was the storm.